Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz, and joining me once again is the great James Stevens Valliant. I almost said the late, great James Stevens Valliant, but I'd imagine you wouldn't have appreciated that much.
Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated.
So, we're doing our series on self-improvement with the help of OPAR, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Dr. Leonard Peikoff. And this week, we are going to be discussing sense perception and volition. Now, obviously, Jim, we're trying to stay away from the really technical stuff, but we're going to have to get into it a little bit. But beforehand, where can people go to get the real technical approach that you're taking to this book?
The book itself. I'm not quite sure I understand the question. There are a number of...
Aren't you doing a series at ARC UK?
Yeah, I was about to say there were a number of wonderful resources, but tomorrow we're actually commencing. We thought we were going to start last week, but we're commencing tomorrow on a detailed technical discussion. Just to give you an idea, if we handled chapter 1 last week, we'll only be able to handle the first section of chapter 1. So we're doing a technical deep dive. So for Ayn Rand Center UK members, you have to be a member. You can come participate in our conversation. And that's what it really is. It's a seminar where I bring my study questions that I present to people, and then they can present their own questions. And we discuss the very technical ins and outs of this very book. Yes.
So sense perception and volition, to me, it's not just to me, but it's a part of gaining knowledge and acquiring knowledge. Now, if we can't count on the evidence that's presented us with our senses, we can have no knowledge, neither knowledge of ourselves, knowledge of other people, knowledge of the external world in general. But in order for us to improve ourselves, we need knowledge. We have to understand how to act in the world. We have to understand how things interact with each other. Knowledge has to be a possibility. So without getting too much in depth, in objectivism, I want you to explain senses and perceptions. What are they? What is the difference?
Well, last week we discussed consciousness and existence and the relationship between consciousness and existence. And we talked about the psychological implications of that relationship. Well, what we were saying before is that existence has primacy over consciousness. That is to say, consciousness, if it's operating correctly, is an apprehension of the way things are. And therefore, errors on my part, wishes, my desires, putting my feelings, in effect, over the facts is a process of detaching myself from reality and making myself subject to reality coming back on me. So in order for nature to be commanded, we said last week, it must be obeyed. This is true about consciousness. Consciousness, since it exists, it's like anything else that exists. It has a specific nature. And for consciousness to serve its function, give me awareness of reality, it has to use a specific means. That is to say, there's no such thing as magical, causeless knowledge. So if we talked about the role of causation last time, we should have gotten into it more, in my view, because an understanding of causation here is really critical. Consciousness is not causeless. It operates by specific means. And the first step of human consciousness is sense perception. That is to say, I can't just magically have the total of the facts of reality impress itself on me automatically. There's got to be an actual process, a causal, physical process. There has to be a physical way in which my consciousness comes into contact with reality, and that's sense perception. It has a specific nature, just like everything else does. It gives me its data in a specific form. It does so by a specific means. And what it delivers is a delimited awareness of reality, or an aspect of reality. So I see I open my eyes, I see, I start paying attention to what I'm listening to, I hear, I feel. That is my initial contact with reality. And without mechanism of some sort, a physical mechanism, eyes, ears, a brain. There's no way for me to access reality. And so sense perception is my means of accessing reality, my primary means of accessing reality. And if there is something else that can come in, that is to say, if we haven't gotten straight what we talked about last week, that is to say, the primacy of existence, if, for example, my consciousness controls reality, then I don't need to submit to the facts. And what do I mean by the facts? How do I initially apprehend facts? Through sense perception. I've got to submit to what my senses are telling me.
Now,
on the other hand, if I don't
go ahead.
distinguish, if I'm not able to distinguish between, say, hallucinations, dreams, and sense perception, I'm literally in the state of psychosis. That is to say, I have no way of dealing with reality, no way of apprehending reality at all. So it's vital that I be able to rely on my senses, know that they're valid, but also know their role within the whole of my consciousness. Obviously, it's not the sum and substance of consciousness, but they're my initial contact with reality. Everything else in my consciousness must, in effect, submit to my contact with reality that comes about through sense perception. Sense perception, it must be the source of my knowledge, the exclusive source of my knowledge, and it must be one that I can rely upon. If I can't, for example, distinguish between hallucinations and dreams and sense perception, I'm lost. I'm lost in the state of psychosis, in fact. So in the context of psychology, or in the context of personal growth and improvement, the evidence of the senses and the validity of the evidence of the senses is obviously a necessary premise. There's no other way of constructing my view of what reality is without that initial causal contact with reality, to which all the rest of my consciousness must conform. It's actually just an application of what we were talking about last week, the primacy of existence.
Now, Jim, sensations last only, for an instant. Something strikes our sensations. That's how long it lasts. The case, this is not the case with perceptions. So what are perceptions?
Our mind automatically integrates sensations into things, objects that I perceive. Those objects, for it to operate properly, those objects have to be at some level objects, right? The book I was just holding up, right? This is an object, but you know something? It's a strange thing. They say that dogs can smell objects. They get a sense of its location and shape just from their sense of smell. Well, we're not like that. Our brains don't organize our sensory material in the same way, say, dogs do. We primarily rely on our vision when it comes to perceiving something as an object, but it integrates it in a number of ways. I see it. I can hear the pages flipping. I'm hearing it. I feel it. I can knock on it. And guess what? I don't need any new active will, any effort on my part to perceive that this is the object, the book that I'm holding in my hand. I can feel it, I can see it, I can hear it, and all of that is being integrated automatically. But just by the color and the shape, just the range of my vision is being automatically integrated by my brain to show me an object.
Right. Now, one of the attacks on the senses, or maybe it's better put as a group of attacks on the senses and on the perceptual level, is that, for instance, I'm looking at a computer screen right now, and the computer screen hits me as one whole, right? I'm on one side, you're on another side. There's different colors on the screen. There's blue, there's red, there's black, there's white. All that is taking place, purple over there. But in reality, what we have are a bunch of vibrating molecules and atoms that are colorless. And so the attack goes that my senses are, once integrated in perceptions, are not giving me an accurate picture. But in the reality is that what my senses are giving me is an entirety, right? They're not just isolating one thing out. I'm getting the interaction of the light that's flashing down, interacting with the way that the molecules form to come together as a screen, the different levels at which each part absorbs light that takes place in it shows me colors. So I am becoming aware of facts of the external world. But the external world is not the only thing that's relevant. My actual sense perceptions are relevant. And it's also not just an isolated object, my computer, it's the entirety. It's the atmosphere in which I'm in, the light, everything is interacting. That's to provide me with perceptions that are automatically integrated. Now, why is that not a weakness of the sense organs, or a weakness of our perceptions?
Well, first of all, how do you know about these molecules? First, I want to know what are these molecules and how do you know they exist? All knowledge must begin with observation. We didn't discover the world, the atomic structure of things, except by a means of logical inference from what we do observe. If our observations were not correct, then nothing that I infer from it, no scientific theory about galaxies or atoms, could possibly get off the ground. The validity of the senses is a premise of all future inference. If, in fact, we say any conceptual knowledge you have has to be grounded in sense perception, that's how we're grounding it in reality. You only know about these molecules because, people will say, I've had, how many times have I had this conversation? That coffee table in front of us, Jim, is really a swirling bunch of atomic clouds, if you could really see it at the smallest level. And therefore, what we're seeing, the coffee table, that we put our coffee on and that we stub our toes against, and I just knocked on, that thing is actually fake. If that thing is fake, then your molecules are fiction. Okay? But the point is that whatever those molecules are, they come together in such a way as to be the coffee table. If you miss the coffee table, you're missing an important part of reality. Okay, use the inference back at us, and we say, no, if the coffee table doesn't exist, if this thing doesn't actually exist, then any inferences I draw about paper and pages and ink are just that worthless. So the table must exist. The table must exist, or I could never get to the point where I could infer that it's comprised of these really, really small molecules and even smaller atoms. Those are simply inferred from the reality of tables and chairs and balls and people that I do see at the perceptual level. In fact, any such theory relies upon it. But of course, I have to have an initial contact. It has to be limited. And this is the thing. What you're asking for is omniscience. Since my sense perception only gives me direct information about the table, it must be somehow flawed because it didn't tell me about the atoms at the very small level. No, that's asking for A not to be A. My knowledge is going to be limited always. It's going to operate by a specific means always, and come in a certain form always, because consciousness possesses identity. It too must adhere to the law of cause and effect. I can't get magical automatic knowledge. There's no such thing as magical knowledge. And so any form of perception, let's say you were a little guy, let's say you were a teeny atom-sized being, and to you, atoms and molecules existed, and they would you could directly perceive the atoms and molecules. For you, the coffee table would be a matter of inference. And I'm sure that these little teeny atom-sized people would say, these atoms that we're perceiving are just an illusion. The reality is it's a giant coffee table. They would have the same argument, depending on where you would start in the level of the size of your perception. If your perception were inky dinky small, the table would be something you'd have to infer by science. For us, we see the table and we infer the atom. Doesn't make the atom less real, doesn't make the table less real. It's just the means by which we come to know, right? So the world of atoms is absolutely correct. There's no question about it, right? But that's a scientific inference based upon observations. You take away the reality of my observations, you've taken away the entire basis for believing in atoms. So both coffee tables that I perceive and the atoms which comprise them at a very small, so small I can't see it level, also are real. Also are just as real. And the inference of one does not make the other less real.
Jim, I'm reminded, and it's silly, but it illustrates the point. When I was a teenager, maybe 14 or 15, I was walking with a friend of mine. And the friend said to me, imagine if we're all part of a dinosaur, like a giant dinosaur. The planets are just organs, molecules, everything that we see is part of this giant dinosaur. And it occurs to me now as you're talking that if this were the case, we cannot perceive the giant dinosaur. We ultimately would have to learn that all of the different aspects of the universe compose the dinosaur, because that's our level of perception. But it wouldn't make our level of perception any less real than a really giant dinosaur that directly perceived that dinosaur. The people that call for that want you to be able to perceive everything there is at once. And because we can't, they say, oh, look, you're flawed. Never mind that the very knowledge that they have of the atoms is based on the sensory perception level of awareness. Ultimately, it turns into conceptual level. But without the starting point of the senses and the perceptions, you could never get to the atoms that they're so fond of speaking about. How did they learn, for instance, that the world separated from the rods and cones of our eyes are colorless? How did they learn which part of our eyes are responsible for perceiving color, or that color just has to do with, wavelengths of light interacting with objects? All of that is based on stems from these sensations. Without our sense organs, we couldn't know any of that. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. Just to know how the senses operate, I need the senses. Just to know how the senses operate, I need the evidence of the senses. All knowledge must have a causal mechanism. Consciousness possesses an identity. If you deny that consciousness possesses an identity, if, for example, the primacy of consciousness, as we talked about last week, if you believe in God or gods or a supernatural dimension, right, then there is a magical causeless means of knowing that. There really has to be, because there's no basis in observed fact for any such thing. And so that becomes the model of knowledge. You see, God can just sort of like with a mind meld transfer to me knowledge in some causeless way. I have a revelation. I have some mystic insight, some mystical experience that somehow bypasses the law of cause and effect and gives me better, truer knowledge, because isn't limited and subject to the law of identity, that sort of thing. Okay. Or on the other side, it's my consciousness that's controlling reality. Therefore, the world around me is the product, in effect, of my own consciousness. If you believe in the primacy of consciousness, if you don't think consciousness possesses an identity and it must submit to reality, right, then you are necessarily lost in a psychological state which really is diseased. The point of consciousness is to correctly apprehend reality. If you can't, as I said at the beginning, you can't distinguish hallucination from perception, then game over. You are the task of self-improvement is impossible. Now, the fact that consciousness possesses an identity refutes both universal skepticism and mysticism. That is to say, God cannot exist. The supernatural cannot exist. Things must operate causally. There is no supernatural dimension. I've got to affect the cause if I want the effect. Our lessons from last time. Without that, there is no standard of sanity. There is no standard by which consciousness is properly operating. There is no standard for psychological health. Full stop. Psychology is a science like any other, too. It must operate by means of observation and be grounded in our primary contact with reality, with the facts of reality. Our consciousness must submit to it. And the first way we submit to reality is by submitting to the observed facts around us. We don't go by wishes, whims. We don't place consciousness, our feelings, our desires above the facts. And when I mean the facts, I mean the stuff we observe.
Okay. As I said, in order to be able to improve ourselves, knowledge has to be possible. And obviously, I think you've done a good job of explaining that the senses are indeed valid, as any attempt to criticize them relies on them. It's the fallacy of the stolen concept. You're using a concept while denying its antecedents.
And they're all self-contradictory. I mean, you'll get someone say, well, look at the railroad tracks. You see, the railroad tracks appear to be getting closer and closer as they go further into the distance. You see, but they don't. There's equal distance, just as they are right at my feet below me. They remain the same distance apart, those two rails. So why should, see, isn't that a deception? Aren't my senses deceiving me into thinking that these railroad tracks are coming together? No, no, no. That is a conceptual misinterpretation of what your senses are telling you. In fact, as you pointed out earlier, the senses are giving you combined information all at once. So do they ever actually touch? No, they don't. But they do appear to be getting smaller and therefore coming together as it gets away from the further away from my eyes. So it's giving me information about distance. If they remain the same distance, if they remained just as parallel below me as they do in the distance, I'd have no way of measuring that distance. I'd have no way of saying, oh, well, that's much further away. So rather than blame our senses for giving us combined information, that is to say, information about the railroad tracks themselves, we say, it's deceiving me into, no, I'm not. And children are not deceived. Children, once they start walking down, it's quite clear now what's going on. It's giving me an additional piece of information, distance. Or the pencil put into water. You put a stick into water, it looks differently in the water than it does the part sticking out. Well, are my senses deceiving me there? No. They're telling you something about the medium through which you're seeing, air versus water. That's what the pencil looks like when it's in water. And every time I put the pencil in water, in the same way, of course, under the same circumstances, it always looks that way. In fact, the fact that the senses are an automatic physiological mechanism are part of your assurance that they are, since the law of cause and effect and the law of identity are true of everything, including consciousness. That is the fact that it operates by a physical mechanism and operates the same way under the same circumstances is your reassurance that the senses are valid.
Jim, when I was a little kid, the summer I turned 11, matter of fact, I went with a friend of mine to stay with his father in Fall River, Massachusetts. And we were in the woods and we looked into the distance. And in the distance, we saw a little stream that we could hop over. And on the other side of that, there was all these big hills. And we said, why don't tomorrow we'll pack some lunches and we'll go on a hike. We'll hop on over that stream and then we'll go and climb those hills. So the next day we went on the hike. When we got there, however, it wasn't a little stream. It was probably an 1/8 to a 1/4 mile distance across. And, my friend's like, no, we can make it. And I know we're not going to try because we're going to drown. But the point is that from the distance, it appeared, much narrower. Once we got there, we saw it. But what I learned from that was objects when you're looking at a distance like that, it appears differently than it does when you're actually there. And so I learned, don't judge by looking far away at something like that. But the point is, if the senses were so invalid, how could I learn that lesson? Right. I was deceived. And I thought it was this far. It wasn't. But I learned that I was wrong because of the evidence of the senses. And I also learned how my senses operate.
In the first instance, your senses didn't deceive you. In the first instance, you made a conceptual assumption.
I made an error. Yes.
Right.
Based on my lack of knowledge of sensations and distances.
And then once your perception gets better as you approach the thing, now you've got different perceptions to compare to and conceptually reevaluate things. Now, that's the really critical thing here. We're not just limited to sense perception. We have this conceptual faculty. We can, perception gives me all kinds of differences and similarities. That I see something, then I'm going to use words here. Now, words are the conceptual level. I haven't yet identified red, green as concepts, but I can see that object, which is red, is different from that object, which is green. Okay, so the difference between red and green is obvious. It's given to me by my sense perception. So I'm given a bunch of similarities and differences, but I have no way of categorizing and integrating those differences and similarities without the conceptual level. And so, how do I combine different observations, integrate different observations, and deal with them as groups? I can only do that with concepts. That is to say, I identify, and not all reds are the same exact. Well, that's in the same spectrum. That's red. That's red. That's red. I get a concept red. That lifts me up from the pure sense perception level to the level at which I'm now grappling with, dealing with lots of observations all at once. And for me to do that, for me to come to a conclusion about the distance in the river like you did, I see the river, it looks like that doesn't look too bad. I can handle that. But then as I approach it, I say, oh no, wait a minute here. I made a wrong assumption based on the distance it was. I didn't recognize that the distance was having an effect on the way I perceived it. It didn't affect how you perceived it at all. In fact, if you go back to the same spot, you'll perceive it in just the same way as you did initially. Yeah. So it wasn't your senses that were deceiving you. It was your a mistake in conceptual identification. That is to say, the way you were putting together your perceptions into a conceptual understanding.
And by the way, when we got there, I didn't say, oh, I'm mistaken now. I was correct before. Let's hop on over. I knew, okay, I was
conceptually mistaken.
Yeah, I realized what error.
I had a similar experience as a teenager. There's this island out there. We were at a beach. There was this island. Well, let's just, a bunch of us guys, let's just swim over there because it doesn't look like it's too far. We swam and we swam. We're not even halfway there and we're exhausted. We thought, my God, it would be so easy. Boy, yeah, but it wasn't my senses. Because we all had the same sense perception before we set out. We were conceptually wrong. We were not perceptually wrong because when we got back to the beach, it looked just the same. And in fact, if you throw something out there and something's between you and the island, now I throw something else that floats on the water. Now I get a different perspective at all. Oh, now my perspective changes and I'm getting still more information, right? But we have to take great care in how we identify what we're perceiving. But the senses are going to operate the same way under the same circumstances every time.
Jim, part of it too, and Leonard, I don't think covers it in here, but it occurred to me when I was first studying this and thinking about the senses, is when we talk about the senses deceiving, or someone talks about the senses deceiving us, it seems like inevitably they focus on sight, only sight, right? The pencil appears bent in water, or the objects, the railroad tracks appear to converge. But we're also not only relying on sight, right? We have smell, we have touch, we have taste, we have hearing. So we learn how when an object looks this way, it usually sounds this way, it feels this way. So we're relying on an abundance of evidence from our senses, not merely on sight.
Absolutely. No, and in fact, if we only had one perception, we could never get to the conceptual level. It is through the differences and similarities that are directly given in perception that I'm able to categorize things and organize them into concepts. Table, chair, blue, green, red, all of those concepts, as simple as they are and directly abstracted from perception, they go, when I talk about red, I'm talking about everything that's ever been read, even things I never knew were read, everything that ever will be read, things I've never seen in this world that are read.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with all things that are read when I use that term read. And so I'm rising above the perceptual level to deal with things within whole categories of it's a table, that's a chair, that's my coffee table, that's a blue coffee table, that's a red chair. To get to that level, right, I have to obviously be grounding all of my information in the direct observation of the senses.
So the next part of the chapter deals with, to me, what is the linchpin of self-improvement, volition, right? Volition, freedom of will, is at once one of the perhaps scariest things and also one of the most empowering. Because on the one hand, you have to say, well, if my will is free, then I'm responsible for my life and how it turns out, barring accidents, of course. Anything can happen. There's unfortunate events in life, but also I'm responsible. I have the power to direct my life. I don't have to be a victim of my upbringing or my genetics. Within, a given range, I can direct my life where I want it to go. Now a few questions come up right away, and I don't know exactly how to. I think first, just let's discuss the objectivist view of volition and what it actually is, what it consists of, what the fundamental choice is. So I'm just going to turn it over to you and explain the objectivist concept of volition, and then we'll get to validating it and how it doesn't conflict with causality and that sort of thing. But first, what is it?
Well, volition is a choice. Our capacity for choice. It's called free will. We can now. A failure to understand the nature of free will is very, very common. I mean, we have determinists. People think we don't have free will at all, even though it may feel like from the inside out, we're making choices. I'm choosing whether or not to pick up this book and show it to you or not. And it feels like I chose that, like it was a volitional choice on my part to pick it up, that I didn't have to do that I might have done otherwise. Well, determinists are saying that sense that you have of choice is all an illusion. It's in effect, it's denying an introspective observation that we have about our own consciousness. Okay, because we don't just have sense perception, we also have a sense of what's going on in our consciousness. And that introspection is telling me, damn, I chose to pick the book up. And what you, Mr. Determinist, are telling me is that I don't really have it. If I understood all the causes that went into that beforehand, I would know that I was actually compelled and had to pick up that book at that time in just the same way every single time. Well, if determinism is true, you're absolutely right. Game over. There's no hope for self-improvement. Things are just going to happen to me inside and out, and I'm just going to be flotsam and jetsam carried along by the causal chain. If you believe that free will is some magical thing that doesn't have a specific identity, that isn't specific, doesn't have a nature, then of course you're believing in effect the primacy of consciousness over reality, and you're believing in magical choice. No, Ayn Rand denied both of those false alternatives. Free will, the only real choice you have. No, can I choose to pick something up? Right, I can. So all of my conscious actions are the product of my volitional choice. Well, what do I mean, conscious actions? Well, when I'm asleep and I just have a reflexive action, or if my stomach is digesting food, that's not a matter of my choice. That's not a matter of my choice. When I am conscious, though, I'm not only perceiving, I'm integrating my perceptions, right? And guess what? I'm directing my consciousness. And for Ayn Rand, it is the capacity, and see, at the level of sense perception, we really don't have volition. As we said, every time you put the pencil in the water, it's going to appear the same way. Every time you look at the railroad tracks, they're going to appear, I'm going to put that in quotes because they don't really appear to converge. They appear to be getting further away. But they appear to converge when they actually are going further away the same way every time. It's not a question of choice. It's not a question of volition. Sense perception is an automatic physical process that happens by means of my physical sense organs and the way my brain integrates those perceptions from those organs to give me the sense perception that I have. It is at the conceptual level, according to Ayn Rand, that choice kicks in. It is when I take the effort of thought, is when I direct my consciousness in the conceptual area, that I have free will. It can be boiled down to saying to think, to engage my conceptual faculty, to focus and direct my conceptual faculty. That is what our primary choice is. And all of my other choices spring from that. Why did I pick this book up? I can give you a very good reason. I was using it as an example in a discussion of sense perception and volition. And so using it as an example in sense perception was also my thinking is what caused me to, in one sense, it was my thinking that caused me to pick up the book right then and there, even though that was a separate and distinguishable choice I made. But where did it come from? It came from my desire to make a point to you and your audience. And that was the product of more conceptual thinking. Ultimately, it is the effort I take right at the beginning to engage my conceptual faculty that is my faculty of choice. My faculty of choice is my ability to engage and direct my conceptual faculty.
Jim, you just put this, because when I think free will, that's the word I think of, effort. And I'm going to get to that in a second. But according to Dr. Peikoff, according to Ayn Rand, the fundamental choice is whether to focus or not, whether to bring our minds into awareness, to bring our full attention on whatever it is that we're doing. But it's also that it's not the only choice. So the other day on Twitter, somebody said a critique of objectivism they had is that they equate free will with focusing. And no, free will is not just focusing.
No, it is not.
The first choice is to focus. But once you're in focus, right, now you can make an abundance of choices.
To the extent I do not engage in the effort of thought, I am a determined automaton. Determinism is true if I do not engage in the act of thought. So all of my other choices stem from, it is true, objectivism does not equate, thinking, not thinking, and that's the only choice you have, and that everything is determined thereafter. No. All of my conscious actions are chosen. But if I'm not engaged in some process of thought, they are determined. I'm going to throw that at you. How do you like that?
No,
that is to the extent that is to say that I don't think I am determined. To the extent that I do think, then my other choices, and see, if I deny free will, then I have no capacity for choice. I'm a determinist. If I say it's not grounded in my choice and effort to think, then I have this magical free will thing. No. There's an intimate relationship between your choices and the fundamental choice to think or not, to engage your brain, your conceptual faculty or not. They're intimately, inextricably linked. All of my other choices. Now, can I do what you would say, do something randomly? Yeah. Even that, if I'm trying to figure out how to do something, just randomly, in fact, we play games on purpose. We roll dice and flip coins on purpose but look, causation still is true. If I knew all the factors involved in the dice result is a determined outcome. Well, the same is true for me as a human being in my consciousness. If I don't engage in the act of thought, develop ideas, those ideas are themselves going to be motivators. Some people may be motivated by, a desire to teach others, get in contact with reality, or a desire to obey God, to appease the deities who are maybe pissed off at me because I believe in the primacy of consciousness. Okay, that doesn't sound like a very psychologically healthy state either. Or I'm the master of the universe, and whatever choices I make, you see, they don't matter. No. Choice is a faculty of consciousness at the conceptual level, and it allows my conscious choices, right, to be in contact with reality. That is to say, if I don't engage in the effort of thought, there's no way for me to even know that my concepts are connected to reality. I could be operating on religion. I could be operating on whim, emotional whim. Free will understood as the act of thought is really critical here, because you put your finger on it. When we're talking about the psychology of self-improvement, go back to the serenity prayer we began last time with. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. If I don't have a correct understanding of free will, I cannot apply that serenity prayer that was so important. First, I have to have a firm view of the absolute of reality. That's the first premise of the serenity prayer. The things I cannot change. The things I cannot change. A is A, that's reality, that's an absolute. I must submit to it. There's nothing, all the pleading, crying, and protesting in the world won't change it. On the other hand, there's things that I can change. And a lot of those have to do with me and the operation of my own consciousness. And if I don't understand what free will is, there's no way for me to know the things I can and cannot change. Free will is about the things I can change. In effect, understanding free will is the answer to the third part, the wisdom to know the difference. Was that within my capacity to change? Now, I'm raised a certain way, and so trauma hit me as a kid. That trauma is still affecting me in a variety of ways, right? I have to be able to prioritize, to be able to introspect, and if I'm going to overcome that trauma, overcome that wince reactions that I might have in future. Say it's a mild trauma, and I'm only having a wince reaction. Okay, I'm just take that with just a little teeny bit. I have to be able to assess my capacity. What caused that? I have to be able to think. Okay, I had this experience, this trauma, and that trauma has actually conditioned things and gotten me not to pay attention to all these other sense perceptions that I have, where say I've got social anxiety as the result of trauma. When I walk into the party, I feel anxiety. Well, there's no one there that's threatening me. I conceptually know that it's really not a threat, but I had this traumatic experience, and so I'm now filled with anxiety. For me to unpack that requires me to engage in a process of thought, a process of introspection, but also a process of extrospection. John and Mary and Joe at the party, they're no threats to me. They're no threats to me. That's conceptual knowledge that I have to engage and integrate if I'm going to have any chance of overcoming the trauma that gave me the social anxiety. You see?
Yes.
So free will is my capacity for cognitive self-regulation, is a fancy way of putting it.
I love that term.
Isn't it? A wonderful term. That is to say, insofar as I do have any control, it is because I have attended to the facts and I'm being conscious. I'm integrating and identifying the actual threat and integrating and identifying this experience as distorting my view of reality. If I can't look back on that traumatic experience and say that traumatic experience is conditioning and distorting my consciousness and it's the way I interact with reality, and I'm not being able to integrate the full set of facts about, John and Mary. Poor John and Mary did nothing to do with the trauma. John and Mary aren't a threat to me. So why do I still feel this social anxiety? So to be able to control the things I can control and make a difference, to have the courage to do that, I've got to know the difference between the metaphysically given, the absolute, right? And the stuff I can control. Now, what did that social anxiety tell me? That told me something about how conceptual conclusions can affect me thereafter. So it's on the level of concepts that I need to do the correction. Fortunately, that's where I have my capacity for choice. I am able to overcome the effect of that trauma because guess what? I have a degree of control over my own consciousness. I can direct my focus, and when that feeling comes up of social anxiety, I act against it with my new cognitive understanding. No, these people are no threat to me. And so now I have to act, and I repeatedly act against that baseless social anxiety. And now I'm starting to reintegrate a correct apprehension of reality and overcome, hopefully, my social anxiety. But without an understanding of what free will is, no process of psychological growth or improvement would be possible.
Jim, when we were discussing effort a few minutes ago, and I think about, Leonard in the book talks about we need to be able to distinguish different states of awareness or different levels of awareness. So when I'm introspecting right now, I'm just coming off the COVID. I've got wicked brain fog. So in order to read the section that I had to read in order to follow what you're saying, and in order to formulate the words that I want to say, I can feel the amount of effort that I have to put forward to do it. It's not happening on its own, right? It's happening by conscious intent, where I can actually feel it occurring. Much the way if I'm working on a math problem, I can feel the effort that I'm putting forth there. Even as much as if there's a conversation taking place in the other room, I can direct my attention to block out other things that are happening to listen to that. That takes effort. That's cognitive regulation, as you said, where I'm directing my attention as I'm doing now. I can differentiate between putting forth this kind of effort and passive drift, where I'm just like, I could just sit here and say, I'm in a fog and let it all go by. Right. So I can differentiate between types of awareness, between effort and non-effort in my psyche, but I also can differentiate on a physical level. If I choose to walk from one end of a room to another, or for instance, I remember when I was a kid, we went to what used to be called Riverside Park. Now it's Six Flags New England. And there was a ride called the Black Widow that I was afraid to go on. I was only 15. And a friend of mine who was 20 and much bigger and much stronger lifted me up and carried me up the stairs to the top of the ride. Now, I clearly can distinguish between that and when I choose to walk up the steps to go on the ride. So there's no dearth of examples where, just to maybe get a little bit ahead to the concept formation stage, toward differentiations and integrations that I'm making to identify what volition is or what freedom of will is, right? It's based on real observations. Now, of course, Leonard says it's self-evident from introspection, and I don't take an issue with that, because I can obviously just see that I'm doing things differently, but I can also differentiate and can also identify the effort that I'm putting through, as juxtaposed to when I sneeze, for instance, which is an automatic reflex.
Important point here to make. Our initial validation of something at the axiomatic level, existence, consciousness, even free will, is directly observed. I directly, introspectively observe the effort it takes for me to think. That does not mean that at the higher levels of abstraction, I can't find all kinds of validation for it.
Yeah.
So, for example, the range of human creativity is further demonstrated. You pointed out what a scary prospect free will is. And it really is. Humans can act as their own destroyers.
Yeah.
If we have the wrong conceptual approach, we can turn ourselves into murderous, suicidal monsters, masochists, sadists, and we can engage in Hitler and the Holocaust. We can also write symphonies and play golf on the moon and split atoms. Now, that is the awesome potential that is free will, but that it can only be unlocked at the conceptual level. And that's life and death. But free will is only operative at the conceptual level. And that's the important thing to distinguish from, say, sense perception. But when you're at the conceptual level, it is absolutely crucial. Now, effort. Things I can, through practice, with things that involve my conscious awareness, can get a lot easier or remain very difficult if I don't put in the effort. I can, to a degree, automatize things. I take piano lessons. And, something is really hard. Dun, 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 dun. Now, when I do that over and over and over, soon it becomes automatized. Automatic. Oh, I now just give my brain, my brain gives the hand the command, do a trill. And it happens automatically without me having to do all that conscious effort. The same is true with consciousness. That is to say, I can become more comfortable at ever higher levels of consciousness, ever higher levels of abstraction. That comfort can be automatized. That is to say, I engage in a logical protocol, a logical flowchart, if you will. And part of that flowchart I've automatized. So thinking itself it can be in part automatized. It doesn't ever change the fact that, that conceptual thought requires some effort. But there is, let me put it this way, to engage in the process of thought still requires me to hit the ignition switch. And in fact, it's more like a dimmer switch, like we said.
I prefer the dimmer switch, yeah.
In fact, I can turn up the intensity of the light, right? And but there are certain things about consciousness where we can call it my reflex is to turn up, in this context, the dimmer switch. But turning that up is still an effort. But being logical, I can give you a logic class, right? Now, logic is a discovery, right? And it is a means of knowing. It's a tool of knowledge. And yet I can become more or less comfortable with it, depending on how well I train myself in being logical. A degree of my self-training will make a high level of abstract awareness easier or harder. Let's put it that way. But at its easiest, it still requires effort. And at the interesting parts, I haven't yet automatized it, and I'll always be pushing. It'll be harder to the extent I don't have logic at all, say, as a tool, before Aristotle, and I'm groping in the dark. Now, think of the effort, the free will effort it took to discover logic, the entire science of logic. That's a breathtaking accomplishment on the part of Aristotle. 3 cheers to his free will. And the effort it took to do that, because now he has made the effort of rational thought that much easier for me. He's given me a roadmap that will start giving me clues and tips on how best to automatize the use of that logic. But every single time I operate conceptually and I try to use logic, it still requires me to have my hands on that dimmer switch.
Now, Leonard says, and I agree, that free will is axiomatic, meaning that any attempt to deny it relies on it. Yeah. Because I'm claiming knowledge. And if I'm claiming knowledge, then I'm claiming the ability to not know, to put forth effort or not put forth effort, to examine evidence, not examine evidence. And if it's all just determined, then every thought I have in my head is determined. The conclusions that I have are determined, including the belief that determinism is real and the belief that it isn't real in the opponent. It all just comes to, it evaporates. It makes no sense.
The determinist is asking you to make a choice.
Yes.
If the determinists weren't doing that, he would have no business arguing. He's thinking that his argument will make a difference to what I believe.
Yes.
And so he's asking me to make a choice.
Yes. Yeah, he's asking you to put forth the effort to weigh his arguments.
Right.
Now, the other day, also on X, somebody said objectivists offer this as proof for that free will is real. But that's not really the case, at least not how I look at it. And I don't think that Leonard ever made the argument.
No, axiom can't be proven.
Yeah. What this does to me is just demonstrates how ridiculous or how nonsensical every other position is.
Look, you cannot logically prove an axiomatic point. It's axiomatic. It's self-evident.
Because proof is dependent
upon it. It's the nature of proof. Look, I can't prove to you the premises of logic because
you'd have to use logic to prove them. Yeah.
Exactly. But what I can do is prove that it is axiomatic. That is to say, you can't help but make choices yourself and demand of others to make choices, even in getting your argument for determinism off the ground. It's inescapable. So all we're proving there is not the initial validity of choice. You feel that from the inside when you take the effort to think. It's that feeling of effort that thought takes that is the sum and total substance of the validation of free will. Just as any observation is the sum and substance of the validation of existence, consciousness, and identity. Right? No, but they all have a built-in defense. This is the way objectivists normally put it. Validated by direct observation, yes, but they have a built-in defense mechanism. Any attempt to deny the validity of the senses, any attempt to deny the axiom of existence or consciousness, any attempt to deny free will, will involve you in a contradiction per force, by necessity. And besides, my determinist friends, free will as we understand it is not an exception to the law of cause and effect.
You always do it. It took 54 minutes and 50 seconds for you to preempt my next question. But you did it nonetheless.
Point would be.
Yeah. So, but it's important. So free will is axiomatic. It is not one of the axiomatic concepts. Leonard puts it that it's a corollary of the law of identity. Now, if causality is identity applied to action, how doesn't free will, the identity of human consciousness, contradict the law of causality? That's my question for you. Now you can go.
Okay. We are determined by our nature to have to make a certain kind of choice or not. And if we don't make that choice, it is a matter of whether we know or whether we live or die. So, but the point is that to have control, that is to say, that cognitive self-regulation thing, is really, really vital. It is vital to the operation of concept formation. I've got to be able to zero in and focus my awareness selectively. And that selective awareness will enhance my awareness, right? So we have a conceptual faculty that is so evolved such that I am compelled to choose. I have no choice in the matter of whether or not I have to think and engage in effort to think, and that thinking is my means of knowing and successful action. That is built in. That's just built in. I must take effort to operate my conceptual faculty. I can't violate the law of cause and effect. Quite the opposite. To know reality, to submit to reality, to be consistent with reality is what I'm trying to do. But even that's not automatic if I don't have this process of cognitive self-regulation. But that's all it is. That's all it is. I can't turn, I can't pull a rabbit out of the hat with free will. I can't, say abracadabra and make whatever I want. My whims don't become reality because I have free will. It is a very specific thing, very limited thing. Now, a very powerful thing as well. Limited as it is, as I say, we can split atoms, we can play golf, shoot golf balls on the moon, because we have this awesome power of conceptual awareness, selective focus. That ability of selective focus, this ability to abstract from sense perception, gives us a superpower, in effect. And that superpower is what we'll get to next time, the conceptual level. This conceptual level.
You did it again. Go ahead.
This conceptual level is a superpower, but it exists. That superpower exists only because I have the capacity for selective focus and awareness. So it's not magic. It's not causeless. It's an example of causation. I have to engage my conceptual faculty by effort. And I've got to operate it by a specific means. It doesn't work, it doesn't yield me knowledge automatically. In fact, the more I understand reality, the more I understand the nature of my consciousness, the better I'll be at it. We discover logic, we discover the scientific method. Okay, so my knowledge, it becomes a self-reflective thing because I can actually control how it is that I'm thinking. Now I'm really got a superpower here. I can really selectively focus so that my I can control the experiments, say, with the scientific method. I can control the factors so that I can abstract on the conceptual level a causal principle of nature, right? But in doing so, all I'm doing is enacting a causal principle of consciousness.
Okay, perfect.
Does that make sense?
It does. And now that we've gotten through free will, in the coming weeks, we are going to be discussing how to use that free will in concept formation, in reasoning, in ethics. So we're in for a great, great ride. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Now, Jim, where can they find you, and where can they find the course you're going to be giving on the book?
Ayn Rand Center UK on Sundays for members, paid members of the Ayn Rand Center UK. We'll be having a much more detailed technical deep dive where we give each chapter a lot more attention. But in this context, this is a really important context, though. And we're going to be doing, when we get to it, it'll be one of the principles on the conceptual level of knowledge is this, what we're going to call the spiral theory. But every single time we get to a new point in philosophy, we're going to spiral back around to the old ones. You notice what this one did. We spiral back to the primacy of existence here. We're going to do that later on. We're going to spiral back to volition. Trust me, many, many, many times. Because in the effort to improve ourselves, right, as you just pointed out, volition is the name of the game. Knowing what it is, what it isn't, what it can do, what it can't do. A world of unearned guilt with people writhing on their therapists' couches, or a world of people feeling total anxiety and totally out of control. These are the kind of options if you don't properly understand free will. And boy, we're going to see it play out in the weeks to come. That's all I can say. But Ayn Rand Center UK, if you want a deeper dive on all of this. On Sunday.
Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you, the audience. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm a very foggy-brained Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.